The night air was unusually cold for early October as Officer John Walker made his final patrol round through the quiet streets of Pine Grove. Most shops had closed hours ago, their darkened windows reflecting his cruiser's headlights as he drove past. It was nearly midnight, and the small town had settled into its typical peaceful silence. Just as he was about to call it a night, a faint sound caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be a stray cat. There were plenty of those around Willie's grocery store, usually hunting for mice near the dumpsters. But something about this sound was different. It was too deliberate, too human. Walker pulled his cruiser into the dimly lit parking lot behind the store, his instincts from 15 years on the force telling him something wasn't right. As he stepped out of his car, the sound became clearer. A quiet rustling accompanied by what seemed like muffled sniffling. "Hello," he called out, his hand instinctively resting on his flashlight. "Is someone there?" The rustling stopped immediately. In the sudden silence, Walker could hear his own heartbeat. He moved closer to the dumpster, his boots crunching on scattered gravel. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing scattered cardboard boxes and discarded produce crates. That's when he saw them, a pair of small, scared eyes peering out from behind a stack of empty boxes. Walker's breath caught in his throat. Those eyes belonged to a child, a young black boy who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. "Hey there, buddy," Walker said softly, immediately crouching down to appear less intimidating. "I'm Officer Walker. Are you okay?" The boy didn't respond, trying to shrink further behind the boxes. In the flashlight's beam, Walker could see how thin the child was, his oversized t-shirt hanging loosely on his small frame. The boy's face was smudged with dirt, and his sneakers were worn through at the toes. "You're not in trouble," Walker assured him, keeping his voice gentle. "I just want to make sure you're safe. Are you hungry?" At the mention of food, the boy's eyes widened slightly. Walker slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out an unopened granola bar he'd forgotten about from his lunch break. He held it out, staying perfectly still as the child cautiously assessed the situation. After what seemed like an eternity, the boy inched forward. His movements were slow and hesitant, like a frightened animal expecting to be chased away at any moment. When he finally reached for the granola bar, Walker could see how badly his hands were shaking. As the boy quickly devoured the snack, Walker noticed bruises on his arms and dark circles under his eyes. His heart ached at the sight. How long had this child been out here? Where was his family? "Can you tell me your name?" Walker asked, still maintaining his distance to avoid scaring the boy. "Anthony," came the barely audible response. "Anthony," Walker repeated warmly. "That's a good name. How long have you been out here, Anthony?" The boy clutched the empty granola bar wrapper, his eyes darting between Walker and the ground. "Don't know," he mumbled. Maybe 2 weeks." Walker felt his stomach drop. 2 weeks? This child had been surviving on dumpster scraps for 2 weeks. The thought made him sick to his stomach. In their small town of just over 20,000 people, how had no one noticed? How had this child slipped through the cracks? "Would you like to come with me and get some real food?" Walker asked carefully. "There's a 24-hour diner just down the street. We can get you a hot meal, and you can tell me what happened. Only if you want to." Anthony hesitated, years of learned distrust visible in his young eyes. But hunger and exhaustion seemed to win out over fear. He gave a tiny nod, and Walker's heart swelled with relief. As they walked to the patrol car together, Walker noticed how Anthony kept a careful distance between them, how his eyes constantly scanned for escape routes. This wasn't just a lost child. This was a boy who had learned the hard way not to trust adults. Walker opened the front passenger door instead of the back, wanting Anthony to know he wasn't under arrest. As the boy carefully climbed in, the overhead light revealed just how thin and malnourished he really was. Walker silently promised himself he wouldn't let this child down. What started as a routine patrol was about to become something much more significant, not just for Anthony and Officer Walker, but for the entire town of Pine Grove. Neither of them knew it yet, but this chance encounter behind a grocery store would spark a chain of events that would challenge their community's preconceptions and change countless lives forever. The fluorescent lights of Pete's all-night diner cast a warm glow over the nearly empty restaurant. Officer Walker sat across from Anthony in a worn red vinyl booth, watching as the boy carefully ate his way through a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. He hadn't said much since they'd arrived, but his eyes lit up when the waitress brought the food. "Slow down a bit, buddy," Walker said gently. "There's plenty more where that came from. Nobody's going to take it away." Anthony paused mid-bite, then deliberately started taking smaller bites. The waitress, Mrs. Chen, who'd worked the night shift for 20 years, discreetly wiped away a tear as she brought over a glass of chocolate milk. She'd seen all sorts in her time at the diner, but something about this small, hungry child touched her heart deeply. "Would you like to tell me what happened?" Walker asked after Anthony had eaten enough to take the edge off his hunger. "How did you end up behind that store?" Anthony stared at his half-empty plate, pushing the remaining eggs around with his fork. "My foster mom," he started, then stopped, his shoulders tensing. "She wasn't nice. She only wanted the money." Walker felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, but kept his voice calm. "What do you mean, she wasn't nice?" "She locked the food away," Anthony whispered, his fingers tightening around the fork. "Said I ate too much. Said I was costing her too much money." He glanced up briefly, then back down. "The other kids got to eat, just not me." Mrs. Chen, who had been pretending to wipe down nearby tables, accidentally knocked over a salt shaker. Walker could see her hands shaking as she cleaned up the spill. "That must have been really hard," Walker said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Is that why you ran away?" Anthony nodded. "I tried telling my social worker, but she didn't believe me. Said I was making up stories." His voice got even quieter. "Like the last time." The last time. Those 3 words held so much pain that Walker had to take a deep breath. How many homes had this child been through? How many times had he tried to ask for help, only to be dismissed? "I believe you, Anthony," Walker said firmly. The boy's head snapped up, surprise clear in his eyes. "I believe every word you're saying, and what happened to you was wrong. Really wrong." Anthony's lower lip trembled slightly, but he quickly pressed his lips together, trying to maintain control. Walker recognized that look. It was the face of a child who had learned that crying only made things worse. "Listen," Walker said, leaning forward slightly. "I need to make some calls to make sure you're safe. But I promise that you won't have to go back there. Okay?" Anthony studied Walker's face intently, looking for any sign of deception. Whatever he saw must have reassured him because he gave a tiny nod. Walker stepped away to make his calls, keeping Anthony in his line of sight. First to the hospital. The boy needed a proper medical checkup. Then to his supervisor, explaining the situation. Finally to his wife Linda, who answered on the first ring despite the late hour. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly. "Remember how we've been talking about making a difference? Well, I think that opportunity just found us." When he returned to the booth, Anthony had finished his meal and was starting to look drowsy. Mrs. Chen had brought him a warm cookie, and he was breaking off tiny pieces, eating them slowly as if to make the treat last as long as possible. "Anthony," Walker said, sliding back into his seat, "we need to get you checked out at the hospital. Make sure you're healthy. Would that be okay?" Fear flashed across Anthony's face. Will they hurt me?" "No, buddy, they just want to help. And I'll stay with you the whole time if you want." Anthony considered this. "The whole time?" "The whole time," Walker confirmed. "I won't leave unless you ask me to." As they drove to the hospital, Walker glanced at Anthony in the passenger seat. The boy was fighting to stay awake, his head nodding forward every few seconds before he jerked it back up. In the glow of passing streetlights, he looked so young, so vulnerable. Walker thought about all the times he'd driven past Willie's grocery store in the past 2 weeks. How many times had Anthony been there, hungry and afraid, while Walker drove by unaware? The thought would haunt him for years to come. But tonight was different. Tonight he had found Anthony, and as they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Walker made a silent vow. This child's story of neglect and survival wouldn't end behind a dumpster. Instead, it would become a story of healing, of trust rebuilt, and of a community forced to open its eyes to the children falling through the cracks in their midst. What Walker didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. The real challenges and the real changes were still to come. The hospital corridors were quiet at this late hour, with only the soft squeak of nurses' shoes and the distant beeping of machines breaking the silence. Officer Walker sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair outside Anthony's room, his uniform jacket draped over his arm. He'd kept his promise to stay, even though Anthony had finally fallen asleep after the doctors finished their examination. The results made Walker's heart heavy: malnutrition, signs of neglect, old bruises that shouldn't be on any child's body. Dr. Thompson, a kind-faced woman with gray-streaked hair, had spoken in quiet, professional terms, but Walker could see the anger in her eyes matching his own. His phone buzzed, another message from Linda. She'd been texting him updates about getting their spare room ready just in case. Just in case of what, they hadn't really discussed yet. But somehow, they both knew something big was about to change in their lives. Officer Walker. He looked up to see a tired-looking social worker approaching. Ms. Rodriguez had driven in from the next county over, called in because all the local workers were dealing with other emergencies. She carried a thick folder and wore an expression he'd seen too many times, the look of someone with too many cases and too few solutions. "I've reviewed Anthony's file," she said, sitting next to him. "It's not good. This is his 6th placement in 2 years." 6th? Walker felt his throat tighten. How is that possible? Ms. Rodriguez sighed, opening the folder. His mother passed away when he was 5. No father in the picture. Extended family either couldn't or wouldn't take him in. After that, she gestured at the pages of reports. The system failed him. Over and over. Walker stared through the door's window at Anthony's sleeping form. The boy looked so peaceful now, his face relaxed for the first time since Walker had found him. Something inside Walker's chest shifted, clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. What if, he started, then cleared his throat. What if there was another option? Ms. Rodriguez looked up from her papers. "What do you mean?" "My wife and I, we've been talking about fostering for a while now. We've taken the classes, done the home study. We were just waiting for the right time." Walker ran a hand through his hair. "Maybe this is that time." The social worker studied him carefully. "Officer Walker, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't like taking in a stray puppy. Anthony has severe trauma. He'll need extensive therapy, patience, understanding. And given his background, there might be challenges, cultural challenges. Are you and your wife prepared for that?" Walker thought about Linda, about their conversations late at night, about making a real difference in their community, about the empty bedroom that they'd been saving for something, about the look in Anthony's eyes when Walker had said he believed him. "We're not perfect," Walker admitted. "We'll make mistakes. We'll need help. But we're willing to learn, to listen, to do whatever it takes." He met Ms. Rodriguez's gaze. That boy in there hasn't had a single adult in his life keep their promises to him in 2 years. "I promised him tonight that he wouldn't go back to that house. I intend to keep that promise." Ms. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone. "I'll need to make some calls. There will be paperwork. Lots of it. And emergency foster placement isn't easy. There are protocols, evaluations." "I understand," Walker said. "Whatever it takes." Just then, a small sound came from Anthony's room. Walker looked in to see the boy stirring restlessly, his face scrunched up in what looked like a nightmare. Without thinking, Walker went in and sat beside the bed. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly. "You're safe now." Anthony's eyes fluttered open, panic flashing across his face before recognition set in. You stayed," he whispered. "I promised, didn't I?" Walker smiled. "And I've got something to ask you, if you're up for it." Anthony pushed himself up slightly, watching Walker with those 2 old eyes. "How would you feel about coming to stay with me and my wife for a while? We have a room all ready and a backyard with a basketball hoop that doesn't get nearly enough use." The boy's face went through a series of emotions: hope, fear, disbelief, and back to hope. "Really?" His voice was so quiet Walker barely heard it. "Really? Only if you want to, though. It's your choice." Anthony looked down at his hands, then at the hospital room, then back at Walker. Would I have to share food with other kids?" Walker felt his heart crack a little more. "No, buddy. There's plenty of food just for you. No sharing required." A tear rolled down Anthony's cheek. the first one Walker had seen him shed. "Okay," he whispered. "I'd like that." Outside the room, Ms. Rodriguez watched the interaction through the window, her phone pressed to her ear. Sometimes, she thought, the system that so often failed these children got something right. And maybe, just maybe, this was one of those times. News travels fast in small towns, and Pine Grove was no exception. Within days of Anthony moving in with the Walkers, the whispers began. They started at the grocery store, spread through church pews, and echoed in the school parking lot. Everyone had an opinion about the white police officer who took in a black foster child. "Did you hear about John Walker?" Mrs. Peterson whispered to her friend over coffee at the local diner. "Taking in that boy from behind Willie's store. Don't you think it's a bit strange?" The diner's owner, Mr. Pete himself, overheard as he refilled their cups. "Strange," he said, setting down the coffee pot with a firm thunk. "What's strange about helping a child in need?" But not everyone shared Mr. Pete's perspective. At the police station, Walker noticed the subtle changes. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, while others made comments just loud enough for him to hear. "Trying to be some kind of hero," one officer muttered during morning briefing, "making us all look bad with this publicity stunt." Walker kept his head high and focused on what mattered. Anthony was finally sleeping through the night, no longer hoarding food under his pillow. Linda had helped him pick out new clothes, and his favorite was a bright blue t-shirt with planets on it. Small victories that meant everything. Then came the anonymous complaint to Child Protective Services. The letter questioned Walker's motivations, suggested he was using Anthony for attention, even hinted that it wasn't appropriate for them to foster across racial lines. The social worker, Ms. Rodriguez, brought the letter during a routine check-in. "We have to investigate all complaints," she explained apologetically. "But I want you to know I'm not concerned. Anthony is clearly thriving here." She was right. The boy who had been found starving in a dumpster was slowly emerging from his shell. His teacher reported that he had started participating in class discussions. At dinner, he had begun sharing stories about his day, even laughing sometimes, a sound that made Linda tear up the first time she heard it. But the tensions in town continued to simmer. One Sunday after church, an elderly woman approached Linda in the parking lot. "I'm sure you mean well, dear," she said, patting Linda's arm. "But don't you think that child would be better off with, his own kind?" Linda took a deep breath, remembering Anthony's face that morning as he proudly showed her the art project he'd made. "Our kind," she replied calmly. "You mean human beings who care about children, because that's exactly what we are." The criticism reached its peak when someone spray-painted "Race Trader" on Walker's police cruiser. He discovered it early one morning before Anthony could see it. As he scrubbed off the paint, his police chief came out to help. The chief said, working on a particularly stubborn spot, "My grandfather used to say that people who throw stones are usually just afraid of their own reflection." He straightened up, looking Walker in the eye. "What you're doing? It's making some folks look in mirrors they've been avoiding for years." That evening, as Walker pulled into their driveway, he saw Anthony sitting on the front porch steps, reading a book. The boy looked up and waved, a genuine smile spreading across his face. In that moment, Walker knew that all the whispers, all the stares, all the small-minded comments couldn't touch what mattered. Inside, Linda was helping Anthony with his science homework. They had created a model solar system that hung from the ceiling in his room. "Did you know?" Anthony said excitedly as Walker walked in. "That light from the sun takes 8 minutes to reach Earth. But it's been traveling through space that whole time, not stopping once." Walker watched his wife and Anthony bent over the textbook together, pointing at diagrams and sharing their enthusiasm for the cosmos. This, he thought, was what family looked like. Not defined by blood or race or what others thought, but by love, trust, and the choice to stand together against whatever storms might come. That night, after Anthony went to bed, Linda found Walker sitting in the living room, lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts," she asked, settling beside him. "I was just thinking about something my mother used to say," he replied. "She always told me that doing the right thing isn't about doing what's easy, it's about doing what's necessary, even when it's hard." He took Linda's hand. "I think she'd be proud of us." Linda squeezed his hand. She would be. And you know what? Those people talking behind our backs, they're not the whole town. Look at how many others have stepped up. She was right. For every negative comment, there had been quiet supporters. Mr. Pate refusing to serve customers who spoke ill of the Walkers. Anthony's teacher spending extra time after school to help him catch up. The neighbors who brought over welcome baskets and offered to babysit. The younger officers who started asking Walker about fostering, seeing something in his example that inspired them. Change was happening in Pine Grove, one small ripple at a time. And at the center of it all was a boy who had gone from surviving to thriving, teaching an entire town about what family really means. 3 months after Anthony came to live with the Walkers, something unexpected happened at the Pine Grove Community Center. What started as a routine town hall meeting turned into something much more meaningful. Officer Walker had been asked to speak about community policing, but when he took the podium, he decided to talk about something else instead. Anthony sat in the front row between Linda and his social worker, wearing his favorite Planet t-shirt and actually looking excited to be there. "I've been a police officer in this town for 15 years, Walker began, his voice steady. But I never truly understood what community meant until 3 months ago, when I found a hungry child behind a grocery store. That night changed everything, not just for me and my family, but for how I see our responsibility to each other." The room was silent, every eye fixed on Walker. Even the teenagers who usually played on their phones during these meetings were paying attention. "Many of you know our story," he continued. "Some of you have supported us. Others have questioned our decisions. But today, I want to talk about what happens next, because Anthony's story isn't unique. Right here in Pine Grove, there are more children who need homes, who need someone to believe in them." In the back of the room, Mrs. Chen from the diner wiped her eyes with a napkin. Next to her, Mr. Pate nodded encouragingly. "My wife and I aren't special," Walker said, looking at Linda. "We're just two people who decided to stop waiting for someone else to make a difference. And now, I'm asking all of you, what difference will you make?" What happened next surprised everyone. Mrs. Peterson, the same woman who had questioned Walker's motives at the diner, stood up. I have something to say," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I was wrong. I judged without understanding, and I want to help." She turned to face the crowd. "I have a big house that's been empty since my children moved away. Maybe it's time to fill it again." That broke the dam. One by one, people started standing up, sharing their own stories and offering to help. A retired teacher volunteered to tutor foster children. The owner of the local bookstore promised to start a reading program. Even some of the officers who had been skeptical began asking about becoming foster parents themselves. Anthony watched it all with wide eyes, squeezing Linda's hand. This was so different from the town halls he'd seen before, where adults talked about road repairs and property taxes. This was about kids like him, about making sure no other child had to hide behind a dumpster to survive. After the meeting, people gathered in small groups, talking excitedly about their plans. Walker noticed Anthony deep in conversation with a shy-looking girl about his age. Her parents were speaking with Ms. Rodriguez about becoming foster parents. "You know what's cool?" Anthony said later that night as they drove home. "When you found me, I thought I was alone. But now there's going to be other kids who get help too." Linda reached back to ruffle his hair. "That's because you helped people understand, sweetie. Sometimes it takes one brave person to show others how to be brave too." The changes in Pine Grove didn't happen overnight, but they were real and lasting. The following month, the police department started a mentoring program for foster youth. Walker led the training sessions, teaching officers how to recognize signs of neglect and build trust with vulnerable children. The community center started hosting monthly dinners for foster families, where kids could play together while parents shared support and advice. Anthony particularly loved these gatherings, proudly showing newer foster kids around and making sure everyone felt welcome. One evening, as they were setting up tables for the dinner, Mr. Pate pulled Walker aside. "You remember that day in my diner?" he asked. "When you first brought Anthony in?" Walker nodded. "How could he forget?" "Well, I've been cooking at these dinners, watching all these families come together, and I realized something," Mr. Pate continued. "What happened that night wasn't just about feeding a hungry child. It was about feeding this town's hungry heart. We needed this, all of us, more than we knew." Looking around the room, Walker had to agree. There was Mrs. Peterson, now a foster mom herself, helping a young boy with his homework. The police chief's wife was organizing a clothing drive for foster teens. Even the elderly woman who had confronted Linda after church had started knitting blankets for every new foster child in town. Anthony's voice carried across the room as he explained the solar system model to some younger kids. "And the light takes 8 whole minutes to reach us from the sun," he said, his hands moving excitedly as he spoke. The other children listened with rapt attention, asking questions and sharing their own interests. Walker felt Linda's arm slip around his waist. "Look at him," she whispered. "Remember how quiet he used to be?" Indeed, the transformation wasn't just in the town, it was in all of them. Anthony was growing more confident every day. The Walkers had learned patience and understanding in ways they never expected, and Pine Grove itself was becoming the kind of community they had always hoped it could be. "One person can't change everything," Walker often said in his training sessions, "but one person can start a change that touches everything." Looking at his son explaining the mysteries of space to his new friends, Walker knew those words had never been more true. 6 months into Anthony's new life with the Walkers, their story caught the attention of a regional news station. The reporter arrived on a sunny Saturday morning, just as Walker was teaching Anthony how to wash their car. "I'm not sure about this," Anthony said nervously, watching the reporter set up her camera. He shifted closer to Walker, soap suds dripping from the sponge in his hands. "We don't have to do it if you don't want to," Walker assured him. "But remember what we talked about? How sharing our story might help other kids." Anthony nodded slowly, looking thoughtful. Over the past months, he'd grown 3 inches taller and gained a healthy weight. More importantly, his eyes had lost that haunted look, replaced by a bright curiosity about the world around him. The interview started in their living room, where family photos now included Anthony's school pictures and candid shots of him playing basketball in the backyard. The reporter, Ms. Brown, had a gentle way of asking questions that put everyone at ease. "What made you decide to take such a big step?" she asked Walker and Linda. Linda smiled, looking at her husband. "Sometimes the biggest decisions are the simplest ones," she said. "We saw a child who needed a family, and we knew we could be that family." "But it wasn't always easy," Walker added honestly. "We had to learn and grow together." Anthony taught us as much as we taught him. When it was Anthony's turn to speak, he surprised everyone with his courage. "I used to think nobody wanted me," he said quietly. "But now I know that's not true, and I want other kids to know that too." The story aired the following week, and the response was overwhelming. The station's phone lines lit up with calls from people wanting to help. Other police departments reached out to learn about Walker's foster care training program. Social workers from neighboring counties came to study Pine Grove's new community support system. But the most meaningful response came from unexpected places. A group of teenagers who had aged out of foster care started mentoring younger kids. Local businesses began offering job training and apprenticeships to foster teens. The high school principal started a scholarship fund for foster children who wanted to attend college. One day, Walker received a letter from a police officer in a city 3 hours away. "I saw your story," it read, "and it made me think about all the kids I see on patrol. Yesterday, I spent an extra hour talking to a troubled teen instead of just writing him up." Sometimes we forget that behind every call, there's a human story. The changes spread beyond foster care too. People in Pine Grove started looking out for each other in new ways. When Mrs. Thompson, an elderly resident, couldn't afford her heating bill, neighbors quietly paid it. When the Rodriguez family lost their home to a fire, the community rallied to help them rebuild. Anthony thrived in this atmosphere of caring. His grades improved dramatically, and he joined the school's science club. Every Wednesday, he volunteered with Linda at the community center, helping younger foster kids with their homework. "You know what's funny?" he said one evening as they worked on his science fair project, a detailed model of the solar system that actually showed the planet's orbits. "I used to hide from police cars. Now I want to be a police officer like Dad, or maybe an astronaut, or both." Walker chuckled, helping him align Neptune's ring. "Both sounds good to me, buddy." The project won first place at the science fair. But what made Anthony proudest wasn't the blue ribbon, It was seeing 3 other foster kids participating in the fair, knowing he had helped make them feel brave enough to enter. As Pine Grove's foster care program grew, other towns began to take notice. Walker was invited to speak at police academies about community policing and child welfare. Linda started a support group for foster parents that grew into a regional network. One evening, as the family walked home from the community center's monthly dinner, they'd passed Willie's grocery store. Anthony paused, looking at the spot behind the building where Walker had found him. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," he said softly, "how different everything is now." Walker put his arm around Anthony's shoulders. "Different in a good way?" Anthony grinned. "The best way. And you know what else? Remember Tommy, the new kid at the center? His foster dad said he wants to be a police officer too." Linda laughed. "Looks like you're starting a trend." As they walked home under the stars, Walker thought about all the changes one small act of kindness had sparked. He thought about the other children who would never have to spend nights behind dumpsters because people had learned to look out for them. He thought about how love, once given room to grow, has a way of spreading far beyond its original source. Back home, Anthony rushed to check on his science fair project, making sure all the planets were still spinning correctly. Walker watched him adjust Mars' orbit with careful fingers, remembering the scared, hungry boy from 6 months ago. Sometimes the biggest transformations start with the smallest moments of courage, the courage to reach out, to trust, to try again. 1 year to the day after Officer Walker found Anthony behind Willie's grocery store, the Pine Grove courthouse was packed with people. Every bench was filled, and folks stood along the walls, all dressed in their Sunday best. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement and joy. Anthony stood between Walker and Linda, wearing a new blue suit that matched Walker's. His hands fidgeted with his tie, but his eyes shone with happiness. Today wasn't just any day, it was adoption day. "Nervous?" Walker whispered, straightening Anthony's tie for the 10th time. "A little," Anthony admitted, "but a good nervous, like before a science test that you know you studied for." Linda squeezed his shoulder, trying to hold back tears. "That's the perfect way to describe it, sweetie." The judge, an older woman with kind eyes, called them forward. As they stood before her bench, she smiled warmly. "I've been doing this job for 30 years, she said, "and days like this are why I love it." She looked down at Anthony. "Young man, I've read a lot about your journey this past year. Would you like to say anything before we make this official?" Anthony took a deep breath. He'd practiced this speech for weeks, but now the words came straight from his heart. "A year ago, I thought I was invisible," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I thought nobody cared if I was hungry or scared or alone. But I was wrong." He looked up at Walker and Linda. "They didn't just give me food and a place to sleep. They gave me a home. They came to all my science fairs. They helped me with homework. They never got mad when I had nightmares or when I was scared to trust them." In the courtroom, Mrs. Chen from the diner dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Mr. Pate wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his own eyes suspiciously moist. "But the best part," Anthony continued, "is that they showed me how to help other kids too. Now when I see someone who looks lonely at school, I remember how it felt, and I know what to do." The judge smiled. "And what do you do?" "I make sure they're not invisible anymore." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the bailiff was discreetly wiping his face. The judge picked up a pen. "Well, I think we've waited long enough. Let's make this family official." As she signed the adoption papers, the whole courtroom erupted in cheers. Mrs. Peterson threw a handful of confetti she'd smuggled in her purse. Anthony's science teacher waved a small banner with planets on it. Officers from Walker's precinct, including those who had once been skeptical, stood and applauded. Outside the courthouse, a celebration awaited. The community had come together to throw a party unlike anything Pine Grove had seen before. Mr. Pate had set up a buffet with all of Anthony's favorite foods. The local bakery had made a cake decorated with stars and planets. Kids from the foster support group released blue balloons into the sky. But the biggest surprise came when the mayor stepped forward with an announcement. "In honor of this day," she declared, "we're establishing the Walker Family Foster Care Initiative. This program will provide resources, support, and training for foster families across our county." Anthony's eyes widened. "They named it after us?" After you, Walker corrected, ruffling his son's hair. You started all of this, buddy. Linda watched as Anthony ran off to play with other kids from his science club. Remember when we were scared we wouldn't know how to be good parents? She asked her husband. Walker laughed. Turns out we just needed to learn along with him. As the afternoon went on, more people shared stories of how the past year had changed them. The police chief talked about how his department had transformed. Teachers spoke about how their classrooms had become more inclusive. Foster parents shed tears and laughter about their journeys. Near sunset, Anthony found a quiet moment with his new parents. They sat on the courthouse steps, watching the celebration continue around them. You know what I learned this year, he said thoughtfully. Family isn't about looking the same or coming from the same place. It's about who stays with you when you're scared and who believes in you when you can't believe in yourself. Walker pulled him close. That's pretty wise for a kid who still can't remember to make his bed. Anthony grinned. Hey, I'm too busy memorizing the distances between planets. Linda joined their hug. Speaking of planets, don't forget you have that presentation tomorrow about space exploration. I won't forget, Anthony said confidently. I'm going to tell my class about how light travels through space, just like hope travels through people. Once it starts, it keeps going. As the sun set over Pine Grove, casting long shadows across the courthouse lawn, the celebration showed no signs of ending. Because this wasn't just about one family becoming official, it was about a community that had learned to see with new eyes, to open their hearts in new ways, and to understand that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. And somewhere out there, perhaps behind another store or in another scared child's heart, the light of hope that started in Pine Grove was already traveling outward, reaching for new horizons, ready to spark another transformation.